it somehow. We will bend like a bow and never break.
Right. Good night, everyone. Good night, Joel. Good night, Richard, and good night, everyone on Facebook and YouTube and everywhere else, wherever you're joining us from. This is our Tuesday night weekly discussion on, economic and financial issues as it relates to Guyana and Guyana's development. Of course, as we had mentioned last week, we are going to be talking this week about local content. That's a big topic for any country, especially a country with newly found resource like Guyana. Of course, we've had resources since back then, way back. But and we've had some local content at that time, and I think looking at the dynamics of today and oil and energy and everything else, and the level of investment and activities, economic activities around oil, it is incumbent that any country ensure that they put in place systems that will protect their local citizen, and it's a great insulator, of course, for the Dutch disease, which we discussed last week. If your people are not up and running and they're not skilled and they're not in the right professions, then after that resource is dried up, then that you're left with nothing else but a dried well. So that's what we're talking about tonight. Of course, we want to thank Channel 28, TVG, who will be rebroadcasting this on their television station every Wednesday, I believe, at 8 p.m. So those of you who are watching and who are sharing it right now, I hope you're sharing it on Facebook and wherever else you can. Again, those who are not online and who are looking at television more often will be able to see this on Channel 28. So that's a warm welcome, to the whole structure that we're building here, the conversation that we're building about economics and Guyana's development. Of course, today we have a special guest with us. I'm quite sure he'll be here more often than he believes he want to be. Richard Rambarran, an economist, executive director of the Guyana, the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and a commentator on various financial and macroeconomic issues in Guyana. And he plays a leading role in the conversation and some of the policy making that we're seeing unfolding in Guyana today. Pretty much a similar profile as my partner JB here, who I think you guys know each other quite a lot and you work with each other a lot and so on. So I think this conversation is going to be good. So JB, what's on your mind this week? We're talking about local content. Um, you might want to welcome your good friend Richard here.
Thank you, Salim. Good evening, viewers. Good evening, Richard. Richard, thank you for accepting my invitation to join us this evening. If I may, Salim, while this show that we've started is relatively new, tonight is our third episode.
It is.
We are not new in terms of doing these sort of programs. I've shared the platform in other forums with Richard doing similar type programs. Richard, as you have correctly introduced him, he's one of few economists in this country who is extremely well qualified and credentialed, and who is very active in practical matters, issues of national importance, national cross-cutting issues, private sector development. In fact, given tonight's topic of local content, Richard, as the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce, at the very outset, he actually his organization, under his leadership, his executive leadership, um, pioneered this whole thing about local content. He even drafted local content legislation. This was back in 2015, 2016, when we just struck
Yeah.
oil in commercial quantities. So Richard has done tremendous amount of work in terms of shaping that local content act
Mhm.
that we have today. And since the passage of that act in December 2021, we've seen all sorts of um, commentaries, all sorts of concerns. There's the CARICOM issue, there's the Trinidadian issue, there is this competition, there is this concern that the Local Content Act is perhaps in contravention with the Treaty of Chagaramas and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And from given the background of Richard and the level of work that he has put into this thing, I think we couldn't get a more suitable guest tonight to speak on this topic.
Absolutely.
Previously, I've listened to Richard. He did several other interviews and feature presentations on local content. He spoke of um, Guyana's global integration with the global economy, and and in his most recent commentary, Richard, you spoke of something that really caught my attention, which I like very much, and I've been talking about repeatedly to business leaders in different circles and in different forums, and that is the Local Content Act. While it is designed to give preference to Guyanese, firstly, while it is intended to maximize the benefit and the value to Guyanese, firstly, at the same time, it does not confer any sense of entitlement
Correct.
to any Guyanese because the sector of itself, oil and gas sector, and throughout the value chain, it is a competitive business. So you could have five Guyanese companies, 100% Guyanese, competing for the same work, but that doesn't mean all five will win. Somebody will win and somebody would lose, and then there will be other opportunities when somebody again, and then there will be some point where everybody might need to collaborate, given the scale of activities that will be required in time to come, given where our production levels are projected to be ramped up to 1 million barrels within the decade and so on. So Richard, thank you very much for coming here and to be our first guest. Um, this is not going to be your first invite. I'm going to reach out to you to be on future shows and to talk about different topics. So, with that said and with that introductory remark from myself and Salim, let me hand the floor over to you now to share your perspectives, based on all of that and some of the things that you would have spoken of in different forums.
Yeah. And if I can interject a little bit, Richard, and leading from what Joel mentioned about your involvement in the where we what we have today as local content legislation. What were some of the activities that led up to that? What are some of the challenges? What were some of the issues, and how did we get here today? I know you definitely had your knee high in it. So I think for those who have listened, we've heard about the pros and cons and all that kind of stuff, but we never learned about what was the impetus, what was the energy behind it, and how it landed to where it is today, which is a significant benefit to Guyanese.
Sure. Thank you both very much for your introduction. Thank you, Joel and Salim, for your kind words. I appreciate it greatly. Firstly, I want to say thank you for inviting me on your program and deeming me to be a worthy guest to contribute
Hmm.
to your conversations. Joel's introduction is correct. I actually have been integrally involved from the very inception regarding local content and the entire discussion around the
Correct.
construct of what local content ought to look like and what it ought to be. And as it's no small secret, I've been associated with the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry for some time now, about half a decade, just a bit over that. And as the keen uh, listener and the keen observer of the Guyanese environment would know, that the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry has been an institution within the country that has been really driving the conversation of the local content uh, instrument in Guyana. But before I get to that and the historical antecedent to which Salim is alluding to, I think it might be a worthwhile venture for us to perhaps give a definitional framework about what it is we are speaking about when we talk about local content. So, within the construct of the Guyanese environment, local content essentially refers to what in country value retention is had from the petroleum industry. Now, in the Guyanese context where we are, is that in 2021 December, His Excellency the President would have assented to a piece of legislation that essentially caters for the petroleum sector, for both operators as well as tier one contractors or prime contractors within the oil and gas sector to procure, employ, and transfer skills and knowledge to Guyanese companies. And within a quick or synopsis of what the legislation is all about that you would have assented to, it refers to how much value from the petroleum sector we can retain in the country, whether it be through the procurement or through the employment from the petroleum sector. So that is essentially, in a succinct form, what local content as an instrument is intended to do. So that is just a prefatory remark on what it is that local content is intended to do. Now, let me perhaps answer pointedly what Salim would have asked, which is regarding the historical antecedent of this all. Now, I entered the private sector subsequent to the discovery or the private, I re-entered the private sector subsequent to the discovery of the petroleum reserves, which would have been found in May 2015. As someone who was living outside of Guyana for that period, I would have, of course, been observing keenly what was happening. And of course, I was away studying my first master's degree during that period and came back to the country and realized that obviously there were a number of occurrences or developments that would have been happening, and Guyanese industry and Guyanese employees or laborers would not, or essentially skilled personnel, would not have been involved at that time. So I worked prior to my post at the Chamber of Commerce. I worked at the Finance Ministry and was actually integrally involved in a number of issues on public financial matters, public financial management, essentially the Natural Resources Fund, and a number of other very important macroeconomic developments at the time. I would have, of course, taken up the post as executive director of Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and this would have been at the time when now Minister Deodat Indar would have been the president of the chamber. So, having a look at what obtained in the economic environment and within the macro construct, we would have come to a recognition that this value chain that is happening within Guyana, there is a significant quantum of benefits that ought to be accrued to Guyanese. And the recognition that we would have given at that point is that, in spite of the fact that a significant quantum of benefits ought to be accrued, this was not the case. And we would have actually heard stories at that point in time about persons actually supplying the offshore vessels and the offshore production operation from neighboring Trinidad, essentially very basic goods that could have been provided by Guyanese, for example, water, other elementary things that
Storage.
provided,
Mhm.
storage, warehousing, and the most meager, if you want to put it in that way, most meager of value, quote unquote, to the productive process of producing oil, or ensuring that we extract these hydrocarbons, would have been outside of Guyana. And through discussions, through outward missions and outbound missions, we began to realize that a significant amount of what needs to be done as not necessarily technical services, but support services, to buttress the oil and gas industry and to ensure that there are significant support pillars for the growth of the oil and gas industry could have actually been provided from the private sector in Guyana. So during 2017, there would have been an outbound mission fielded to Newfoundland and Labrador, which is, of course, in Canada, from the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And we would have observed there what the developments were, concomitant with the development of the oil and gas sector in Newfoundland. Now, when we hosted discussions with the folks from the Newfoundland and Labrador Industry Association, Oil and Gas Industry Association, as well as the Environmental Industry Association, NOIA and NIA, we would have realized that it is not a matter of happenstance by which this development occurred, but rather one of deliberate policy and regulation and legislation. And if one pays keen attention to actually what obtains within the province of Newfoundland, you would realize that perhaps in parallel to us, they were an artisanal economy. They were an economy that was essentially a primary producer of commodities. They would have discovered hydrocarbons and subsequently proceeded along the development path of extraction. Now, with that being understood, we tried to further ascertain what it is that actually were the instruments that permitted this type of development for the transformation from an artisanal economy to one which is now a modern powerhouse. And I would want to say that that perhaps was the initial impetus in terms of understanding the level, the degree, and the quantum of value which can obtain to a local economy to essentially transform it from one that is what we say in economic development, a backward economy, but essentially one of a low value production economy to one which is of a higher production value. Now, upon returning, and this is of course in 2017, one has to remember the particular economic context which we were in. And this is one where the then Minister of Finance, Winston Jordan, of course, was on his foray to adjust a number of fiscal policy instruments, and we were in a very uncertain macroeconomic environment without very clear direction. So, in spite of the fact that the Chamber of Commerce in Guyana has been the oldest and for some time the largest private sector umbrella organization, there was not an initial receptiveness to the idea. So we talk about a route of public advocacy and public agitation, quote unquote, if you will, of course, in a non-violent form, but public agitation to ensure that the message is brought not just from us, but also from regional persons. And it is for that reason that we would have fielded, for example, former Energy Minister Kevin Rambarran from Trinidad and Tobago, from neighboring Trinidad. We would have brought in former Speaker of the National Assembly, Harry Rambarran, to discuss both the petroleum experience as well as the legislative perspective in terms of introducing the local content legislation in Guyana. So, all of that being said, we eventually, during the year of 2018, witnessed a significant de-risking of the basin by a number of discoveries that were had in the exploration foray of ExxonMobil at that time. So, and those who were here during that period, particularly those involved in the direct operations of ExxonMobil, would tell you that we were well above the global rate of wells that were successful to wells that were spotted. We were well above that rate. So within 2018, we had a significant de-risking of the basin. Now, as you can imagine, quite a lot has happened from 2018 to now. So permit me, if I can't remember the specific dates, etc., about these things. Maybe it might be a
But
worthwhile.
I definitely think the background is very, very important. That's why I asked the question. I think we
Maybe
need to,
maybe it might
it's
be
important
a
we get here.
worthwhile venture for us to look at the documentary on it, which might be something that we'll pursue.
Absolutely, definitely, yeah.
But essentially from 2018 to 2020, what we had from government was three successive rounds of not just consultation, but the production and eventual adoption in February of 2020 or January of 2020 of a local content policy. So the Chamber of Commerce, but I just want to say tonight that I speak on behalf of myself as an economist and not necessarily as a representative of the Chamber of Commerce, but just someone commentating as someone been involved in the Chamber of Commerce. But the Chamber of Commerce, of course, has always been advocating that a local content policy must then be transformed into a local content legislation. So during that period, 2018 to 2020, we would have seen an iterative process where we eventually resulted in the adoption by the government in 2020 February of the local content policy. Now, that local content policy was one which it was in some ways different from what the GCCI and the other commentators within the particular discussion, the public discussion on local content would have been speaking about. Why? We have always argued, and myself in particular, I've always argued that local content, what is very important and instrumental for local content, is that the litmus test for one, who is considered a Guyanese, and then secondly, what is considered as a Guyanese company, ought to be beyond just the fact that one is incorporated in Guyana. Now, we did not find that obtaining in the February 2020 local content policy, which was essentially the third draft of the local content policy adopted into legislation during that period. And thus, we know what happened in March 2020. We had an election. COVID-19 came in Guyana. We had 5 months of the election debacle. Then in August 2020, we had a new administration. COVID-19, of course, continued its presence in Guyana. Now, from August 2020, we then were engaged by the government of Guyana. I think in March of 2021, we attended a plenary at the Arthur Young Convention Center. During that period of time, there was a circulation of a draft local content policy, which eventually transformed into a final piece of legislation in December of 2021, which is now what we see as being the local content legislation. Now, local content legislation, as it is in 2021, has a number of different instruments from the initial policy, which was in February 2020. And that is to say that the litmus test for a Guyanese company is different. The local content legislation now in Guyana is one which ring fences particular areas within the petroleum sector, within procurement of the petroleum sector for Guyanese industry. And it is also one which speaks more strongly to skills transfers and the procurement plans and penalties explicit for operations within the sector. Interestingly, also, where a differential lies between the February 2020 policy and the December 2021 piece of legislation is that there is no longer that role which the February 2020 policy had for CARICOM states or CARICOM member states, as opposed to what we see now in the December 2021 legislation. So this is where we are now, Salim and JB. And effectively, I just wanted to capture some of that
Yes.
historical antecedent by way of cursory or prefatory
Yes,
remarks.
yeah. I
Thank
think
you.
I think that was important for our listeners, and of course us to learn about the path that landed where we are today. JB, your thoughts
Yeah,
on that was very rich content there.
yeah. I am happy that you went into some in that level of depth in the historic development of this whole local content follow, following the discovery of oil in 2015. And if I may add to what you to some of what you've mentioned, you spoke about two things that stood out to me. You spoke about the three draft policies by the previous administration, and you spoke about the type of the macroeconomic policy at the time, which from a private sector perspective, there was great uncertainty. There was no clarity, and hence private sector needs some. There is always uncertainty in the business environment, but for there to be confidence, the policy need to show a direction, need to point you into a direction, and the policy
Absolutely.
at the time pointed the private sector into no prosperous direction. And Richard and both myself and Richard, we have done in our own personal capacities and in our official capacities and in these private sector organizations have done many analyses to to validate those arguments. The other point I wanted to make, which is of particular interest to me, I would have studied um, those draft policy, local content policy. Now, Richard give his history when he joined the chamber's executive director. I joined a couple of years later. But prior to my joining the private sector commission at that time, I'm no longer the private sector commission, by the way. But prior to me joining the private sector commission, I was doing a lot of, I was doing my column. And through my column, my weekly column on the economy and finance, which I started in April 2017 with Guyana Times, I would have dealt with this matter and done several reviews and analyses on the different draft local content policies. And the first two, if I'm to summarize it, just in the interest of the viewers, for them to understand the challenges we have had from a private sector perspective, um, 5 years ago to come to where we are today. The first two draft policies, um, Salem and Richard, my conclusion was it was a whole bunch of fluff. Um, and I conclude that this was not a pragmatic policy paper. They were more an academic paper, with a whole bunch of academic, wishful, fanciful textbook kind of stuff. No pragmatism, no context to the specifics of Guyana and those sort of things. And then, more interestingly, by the time the third draft came out, there were some bit of consultations that Richard spoke of, which for me it was only for the optics, because nothing that we submitted through those consultations, both in verbal presentations and written submissions, were reflected in the local content third draft policy. This is under the previous administration, for clarity. The first page that introduces the policy, the objective of the policy, spoke to something that which stood out to me surprisingly. It says that this policy is only, I'm paraphrasing here, right? It's not the exact words, I'm paraphrasing what is stated here. This policy is designed strictly for the upstream sector. Now, that's a slap in our face, and I'll tell you why. There is no Guyanese company. There is not a single Guyanese company, or not a group of Guyanese company that has the resources, that has the capital, that has the technology, that has the experience and the know-how to invest in the upstream sector. The upstream sector, for simplicity, is the offshore operations which ExxonMobil and its consortium partners are involved in, the exploration, the drilling, the extraction, the production of the raw crude. And the development cost for one phase alone, LISA 1, let's use LISA 1 numbers, was 4.44 billion US and change. 4 billion US and change is our pre-oil GDP was 4.3 billion US. So the development phase, the cost, the capital to develop one phase alone was equal to the entire GDP of this whole country, right? And if you take the total liquid assets in the banking sector, it is not even, it doesn't, it's less than 2 billion US, less than 2 billion US. So if you take all the money we have in the bank and say to the private sector, look, the whole of Guyana, you all go and set up a company and go and
Okay.
invest in the upstream sector. We ain't got enough money to do it, right?
Yeah.
So it's absolutely nonsensical, you know. And the way a lot of people see it and the way I see it is as though the administration, then its thinking was that they were not really interested in having any local content policy. They were not interested in maximizing the benefits and the value to the people of this
Yeah.
country.
I think that that's a case of their litany of competence or just a plain old typo. It's a typo error. How could you go upstream and compete with the, like you said, billions of dollars?
Right. And you could do, we have all, I still have all the work I did. Richard has his. If you take all this, our submissions, and you put it alongside in a tabular format and compare it with the third draft petroleum, you would see absolutely nothing that we submitted is in there. Fast forward to, post 2020, the new administration took over. They took local content a bit, way much more serious than any other government.
Yeah.
And if you do the same exercise, take our same written submissions and you put it alongside that legislate with that legislation, now policy to legislation, you would see a reflection of a lot of the things we submitted,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so now we're at the point of implementation. So we've gone through the hurdle of getting the government of the day to implement the local content legislation, to put in place the legal framework. That has been done. Now it's the implementation. Now it's for that policy, that legislation to work for
Yeah.
us. And also we have our role to play. We have a responsibility both as individuals and as companies, as individual companies and as collective,
Now,
uh, build the capacity and so on.
as Richard mentioned, that there were two big questions that needed to be answered in the previous drafts before the legislation. It was, who is a Guyanese, and what is a Guyanese company. So maybe you guys can take a stab at that, based on what the legislation has defined Guyanese to be, and are Guyanese only in Guyana? Are Guyanese in the diaspora, for example, United States or Canada? And how are they defined, or how is their definition of being a Guyanese being recognized in the current legislation?
Right. So thank you. I think the local content legislation now has a very good definition, if you will, of those two, a definition of a response to those two questions. Firstly, who is a Guyanese? A Guyanese is essentially someone who is a citizen of Guyana in accordance with the Citizenship Act. Now, that does not necessarily mean residency in Guyana, but it speaks to someone who is Guyanese, irrespective of whichever part of the world they are located in. So that's the first thing about who a Guyanese actually is. Whether or not, however, I'll caveat that by saying whether or not we want to consanguinity, which is of third degree of or something of the sort, one has to, of course, we need, that is something that we perhaps need to have as a national conversation, but that is not necessarily entangled directly with local content. There are other aspects of the citizenship that one ought to consider, but just want to put that out there as a matter of thought and of food for discussion. So I'll leave that bit. And then the second, of course, is
A
what
quick question on that. If someone was born in the United States to Guyanese parents, are they considered Guyanese?
Well, who is a Guyanese is all dependent upon which passport they are holding, whichever country it is that they have citizenship for. So I could be born to Guyanese parents and I'm entitled to be a Guyanese citizen, but I never take it up. I perhaps take up my American citizenship. And of course, Guyana, as you know, is a country that's very open in terms of its ability, your ability to hold dual citizenship, etc. So nothing precludes someone who has been birthed to parents of Guyanese lineage to apply for Guyanese citizenship and obtain Guyanese citizenship. So it is necessarily about what you hold, if you are the holder of a Guyanese citizenship, and we are very liberal in Guyana with who it is that we consider to be a Guyanese citizen. So that is just on the point of who is a Guyanese, but more importantly, how one obtains citizenship of Guyanese of Guyanese nature. Now that is one. Secondly, what is a Guyanese company? And this is where Joel alludes to about what the work has been previously. And for me, this is something that I have particularly always emphasized. A Guyanese company cannot be one that is solely incorporated in Guyana. And this, for me, is the mistake that all three drafts of the local content policy prior to February 2020 would have made. So the first draft, which would have been perhaps in 2017, September thereabouts, I think, or subsequently. But the three drafts that went from 2017 all the way to 2020 February, that is where, for me, the weakness lay. Because how a Guyanese company is defined and the litmus test for a Guyanese company ought not to rest solely on one dimension. It's not a unidimensional structure. It is one where necessarily one has to examine whether this company is employing Guyanese, whether the company is controlled in its decisions by Guyanese. Essentially, who controls the operations and essentially is the directive of the where the directive of the company comes from. Additionally, how much does the company utilize local materials or local skilled personnel, etc. All of that essentially forms the ethos of what a Guyanese company is. I think if one checks the previous, if you have a look at the previous public drafts of what the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, for example, would have put forward, you would have seen that we would have had in those drafts a couple of other dimensions. For example, board meetings to be held in Guyana and such the like. But those, it is not as if, those were hard and fast things. What we were doing was we were essentially suggesting what dimensions of the litmus test can be looked at in terms of the test of locality. So that is the response. Of course, now we have a regime which defines a Guyanese as one who is the holder of the Guyanese citizenship in accordance with the Citizenship Act, and then a Guyanese company, one which is 51% controlled by a Guyanese citizen or a Guyanese company, then 75% of senior management being Guyanese citizens, and then 90% of the workforce of that company being Guyanese. So if I'm to answer whether I'm content with that definition, I would say that I'm content. And the reason being is that, of course, it adds a multi-dimensional test of locality to what is considered a local company.
Richard, if I'm to ask you a question now to tap on your emotion, having worked and fought ardently for the last 5+ years um, for local content, then local content legislation. How do you feel when another country within the region comes and say, after you've succeeded, your work and your hard work paid off, your effort and everything paid off, then somebody just wake up and said, hey, we're going to challenge this thing, there is contravention of some treaties and so on. How
Yeah.
what was your reaction and feeling when that happened, given
Well,
your ardent work and you fought for this thing personally and professionally?
Blood, sweat, and tears, as they say.
yeah. So maybe I would want to separate out what I feel personally, and then what my opinion is, if there is space, of course, to proffer that. Um, in the first instance, and for those who know me would know that I am someone who is essentially a nationalist. I love Guyana. I have returned to this country voluntarily to offer my services, my skill set, etc. When I've had the opportunity to be in other spheres and other places. And so I'm someone that loves Guyana. I've resided in Guyana for a majority of my life, and hence, in some regards, I would say that I'm a nationalist, I'm a patriot, and I put Guyana first. There is, of course, a nexus that exists between Guyana and our Caribbean brothers and sisters. But for me, it is always Guyana first. It is always my country first. And it's part of the reason why I've always personally, professionally, intellectually, and within my academic undertakings sought to ensure that what we endeavor for puts Guyana first and Guyana
Absolutely.
first at all points in time. So I am of the personal belief that when one is birthed into a country, that you have a social contract that exists between yourself and the state, and that is one's birthright, and that is something that obtains as a social contract between an individual and the state as an institution. And it is for that reason that every citizen of the country or every citizen of a country is always blessed with whatever entitlement accrues or obtains from the natural patrimony. Because the constitution of the country, which is, of course, the supreme land of the law and at its core, the social contract between state and citizen, the constitution of the country dictates that the national patrimony is the property, it is the birthright, and it is a social contract between the state and a citizen of that country. And so, for that reason, I think that there is no question that the resources of the state and the resources of Guyana and all of the benefits that obtain and accrue, whether it be financial or the concomitant development occurrences, all of it belongs to Guyanese citizens. All right? Whatever we enter into, subsidiary or subsequent to the Constitution and everything that flows thereafter, whether it be treaty, whether it be some extension of some accord that manifests itself in international law, um, all of that remains subservient to the
The
Constitution
local.
that sets up an instrument between the citizen and the state on what it is that Guyanese ought to benefit from. And therefore, by logical extension, there can be no space for an argument that the national patrimony of Guyanese does not belong in form as well as substance to the Guyanese citizen.
Yeah.
So that would be from a philosophical approach what it is that I'd have to proffer on that argument. And so, should anyone try to contravene that logical sequence that not only obtains in Guyana but obtains internationally within different countries' experience, I'd ought to say that perhaps they're out of their depth, or maybe they don't understand, or maybe what they are doing it for would be on a matter of personal greed or for personal benefit.
JB, I don't know what you think, but I think that was a long answer that Richard gave for that he's not happy. You know.
Yeah. And
No, no, Salim, I would not say that I am not happy, and this is where I think I wanted to say, because Joel asked me what my personal feeling was, and that's what my personal feeling was. However, I also am a believer in natural justice. I also am a believer that persons who do not believe that something is necessarily right have the redress to court, they have the redress to challenge,
Absolutely.
and there are instruments that exist within modern and functional democracies and free society, and of course modern economies, to cater for those who necessarily do not agree with particular developments. And this does not obtain only within a domestic context, but also within a regional context. Should someone do something that violates what then becomes international law for a particular sovereign state, then there are methods to which one can seek redress, or there is recourse for one's action. Take, for example, if Guyana is to go maybe fighting some cases of non-tariff barriers that we see existing in blatant violation of the treaty, there is a method through which Guyana can approach for particular redress. So it is not that I am not happy or that I am sad about the occurrences, etc. But I'm just, stating from a personal point of view what it is that my perspective from an initial point would have been. And then subsequently, I, of course, am a believer in natural justice.
I want to get both of you take on this also, with local content versus what the president has been championing. The president has been championing not a petro economy, but more of a diversified economy. Yes, we've got oil, and it's a significant part of the energy that's fueling the economy, but we've got significant competency in agriculture, in tourism, in so many other sectors, mining, forestry, and so on. With local content, kind of giving a very structured framework for Guyanese and our Guyanese companies to and incentivize them also to get into the oil. Does it pull, or does it create any conflict with that strategy of creating that robust, diverse economy? Is there a conflict there? Is there a concern there? Do we see that? And even the president himself has mentioned a few times that companies can find workers. A lot of our professionals are going into the oil and gas sector. So I'm just trying to figure out whether I'm sure we've got to do both. We've got to sustain the oil sector with the professionals and ensure that Guyana gets a big part of that pie. In addition to that, we have to also ensure that we do the same for agriculture and forestry and other significant areas that we have relied on for decades. So where is the you guys see a conflict there maybe?
Well, well, like maybe you might want me to go. I don't know.
Yeah, go
Yes.
ahead, Richard.
Sure, sure. Now, naturally, there exists a congruence between the petroleum sector, the presence of the petroleum sector, and the underdevelopment of a country, or its stagnation of its growth
Absolutely, yeah.
process. And this, of course, has been coined as being a natural resources curse, or what we understand commonly to be the Dutch disease, quote unquote. Now, I want to say that it is to the credit of the government that they are championing
Yes.
other
Yes.
areas of development, because if one is to understand essentially what the natural resources curse is, it is at its core allowing only one sector to develop,
Absolutely.
and that is whatever it is, the particular natural resources, whether it be gold, whether it be petroleum, whether it be any other resource from the extractive industry. So the government ought to be commended on the point that they are pushing the not just the production but the productivity in other sectors, because those are very important components of mitigating against the Dutch disease.
Yeah.
Now, there are some proponents within the Guyanese economy that would say, leave the oil in the ground, and let us perhaps proceed along whatever development path we are on, absent of the involvement of our hydrocarbon resources. This, for me, is a nonsensical view, and I can enter into that discussion as we proceed. But I want to say pointedly that it is to the commendation of the administration that they are focusing on the production and the productivity of other sectors, non-oil and gas sectors, because as we are aware, a couple of things. One, the oil and gas sector is a capital intensive sector, and it is not a labor intensive sector. It is for that reason that tremendous employment will come not necessarily from the direct employment from the oil and gas sector, but the other sectors that are
Correct.
in
And that's key.
support of the oil and gas sector. Uh, Additionally, it is noteworthy to mention that the oil and gas sector can have an uh, an effect on your economy where it introduces an additional dimension of volatility. And when one has a strong non-oil and gas sector running in tandem with the oil and gas sector, as has been seen throughout 29 resource-rich developing economies, there is a tendency to ensure that volatility that exists in the oil and gas sector, particularly when supported by a sovereign wealth fund that is managed properly, does not leak in to the vulnerable groups in society. And I think we are at a fairly good place in Guyana, where we have had discoveries of the oil and gas. We've had the institution of a sovereign wealth fund. We have had now the local content legislation as an instrument for local businesses, and we have a government that understands that we
Yeah.
need to not just drive hydrocarbon exploration and extraction and the petroleum sector development, but we need to ensure that the other sectors, the traditional sectors of the Guyanese economy, are supported and support growth essentially. So I think it's to their credit. I think that we ought to ensure that we promote the sectors, and really that is where we will find our development path, balancing the oil and gas sector with the oil and gas sector.
And Joel, I mean, we've got like a few minutes more. I want you to take your stab at it. Does a robust local content participation a threat to this diverse economy that and the vision that the president so eloquently talks about quite often.
Uh, Not at all. It is not a threat by any means and any standard. I endorse fully what Richard has said. It's more complementary, it's necessary, and the government of the day, His Excellency the President, has a very deep understanding and appreciation for um, our inherent challenges and what are the solutions we need to take us into the future and to develop this economy and to develop this country to make it more prosperous for all of us, all of the people, all of our people. Um, Last week, we spoke extensively about the Dutch disease and how to avoid it and we went into great depth, you and I, what the government is doing currently. So I don't want to regurgitate those, you know. Um, but just to add something else to the discussion from the local content and the threat by some of our or a group of our regional counterpart, I want to say that the crux of that contention, the main contention, is that the the Local Content Act excludes participation. That is not true. The Local Content Act does not exclude participation. It facilitates participation through a formula for joint venture, where part of the definition, Richard was talking about the definition for a Guyanese company. There are three criteria that you have to tick to be regarded as a Guyanese company in accordance with the Local Content Act. That is the ownership,
Yeah.
um, 51% Guyanese ownership and control, 90% senior management slash executive management, 75% local Guyanese employees, the staff, right? So companies from other parts of the region and international companies are welcome to come to
There's a
Guyana
framework for that. There's a
and
framework to
look
make it happen.
for suitable partnerships and form joint ventures, a 51-49% formula. So how could that be exclusion? And then the act, there is a schedule 1 in the act. It only carved out 40 um, areas, goods and services for Guyanese preferences. Richard would tell you that there are over 200 different types of opportunities and goods and services that are required to service the sector. That we haven't yet developed the capacity. So the act in no way, promotes or facilitate exclusion, right? That's how you're going to build capacity through joint ventures and so on. And in fact, there are, Trinidadian companies here that are in partnership with local companies, right? So this whole thing, my comment
And
that I
other
want,
countries too, not Trinidad only, other
yeah,
countries too.
I don't think, no,
Mhm.
it is not a position of Trinidad. Uh, it cannot be a position of Trinidad because there is a certain group in the Trinidad private sector who respects and who are genuine to work with Guyanese, with their Guyanese counterpart. And there is a small group of Trinidadians who historically have been arrogant and they're still arrogant and they think they have this sense of entitlement and they just want to bulldoze their way without any regard and respect for us.
Yeah.
So that's not how you're gonna have regional integration and regional prosperity. There has to be mutual respect. You need to respect our laws, and you need to work within the framework that exists,
Yeah.
right? So that is it's now 3 minutes
Yeah.
past eight
Yeah.
o'clock.
We've been.
Date. So let's wrap up now. I'll ask Richard to give his closing remarks. Sum up um, what
Mhm.
you've said tonight. What do you have to say to your Trinidadian counterparts in the context of tonight's discussion? And based on the name of this show,
What's
part
in
of
it
this,
for you?
what's in it for you? What does it mean? What does this
Yeah.
local content mean for the average Guyanese and for the
Yeah.
average
Yep.
Guyanese company? Your closing remark.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, I was just getting warmed up, but I'm sorry. I'm sad to say that we have to end the program. For my point, I was now finishing off my introductory remarks. But okay, I'll begin to wrap up.
Yeah.
Um, well, what's in it for me? I am an average Guyanese citizen, and I look forward to seeing a couple of things. I look forward, of course, to seeing the benefits within the public sphere. I look forward to seeing the public goods of the country improved. That, of course, includes better healthcare from the public system, better education being provided for all Guyanese, better infrastructure being provided. And all of that, of course, comes through government, government budgets, and government expenditure. I also, on the government side and what the government can provide. And in addition to, I also look forward to a fourth public good, which is that of macroeconomic stability. And I trust that based on the instruments that we currently have in place, some improvements, of course, that can be made, that we will preserve our precious macroeconomic environment and that stability which is obtained in Guyana, particularly from the early 2000s up until uh, 20, the mid part of 2010 to
Yeah.
2020. Um, because, of course, we see what can be the effect of inflation and rising inflation for the average person. So that is on the first dimension as it relates to what the government can do. I think those four things in particular, I look forward to. On in terms of the second dimension of what I look forward to greater opportunities in two regards. One, for MSMEs, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and what they can benefit from and access from the economy. Bearing in mind that it does not necessarily mean to supply the oil and gas sector, but one can always supply
Yeah.
supporting services that grow in accordance with or concomitant to the oil and gas sector. So I look forward to that, as well as the second aspect of the increased opportunities is increased opportunities for employment. I look forward to seeing every Guyanese citizen having a decent work, or what the United Nations, of course, talks about in their seventh sustainable development goal as being decent work for all. I look forward to that, and really seeing that all Guyanese citizens are able to benefit materially from public goods, a stable macroeconomic environment, opportunities, whether it be opportunities to start an enterprise, or whether it be opportunities to be employed. I look forward to the day that we are at that position, and I think honestly, we are on the way to that. Of course, we have to ensure that we maintain that vision, that focus, and I think that where we're headed on, at least it's a path that one can observe that end at some point. So I don't think that we are regressing. I don't think that what we're doing is retrograde or retrospective in any way. I think that we are moving along, but we ought to bear in mind what challenges can accompany a natural resource driven growth cycle. So we need to be cognizant of that. So that is the first thing about what's in it for me, or what's in it for the average Guyanese person, myself being an average Guyanese citizen. Secondly, I wanted to just allude to something that I would have mentioned earlier, because I thought we would have touched on it a bit more if time had permitted, is the fact that this nonsensical argument of leaving the petroleum reserves in the ground is one which ought to be utterly rejected, outright dispelled, and in no way accommodated by right thinking Guyanese who want to see this country progress. If one understands where we are within a global development trajectory, you would know that we have a closing window, and one that is closing very rapidly on the period in which we can capitalize or utilize this resource which we have. We perhaps will be the last frontier economy when the history of the global economy is written. We will perhaps be the last frontier economy to produce hydrocarbons, to produce petroleum in the way that has been traditionally done, which is, of course, extraction from the earth and producing energy in that form. And it is something that, of course, we know the world is moving towards its reduction by 2050. But given where we are as a country in terms of our carbon capture and the fact that we are a net carbon sink and a net sequester of carbon, I think that we are in a good position to make a strong argument within the international arena that come what may, in that matrix of energy, that Guyana ought to remain one of the providers of fossil fuel, because that energy mix that is being discussed for 2050, or the world moving towards net zero by 2050, does not exclude the producer of fossil fuel. And if one thinks about it, given what our natural patrimony has blessed us with in terms of a light sweet crude and its low cost of production and its relatively low impact on the economy, not the economy, the environment, when juxtaposed against other forms of oil and gas, I think that we are in a very good position to argue a point that we ought to be one of the suppliers of that delicate component of fossil fuels that will exist in 2050 when we reach an economy, a global economy that is at net zero. So I don't think that this nonsensical argument of leaving it in the ground ought to be in any way accommodated. It ought to be rejected for what it is, which is outright rubbish. I think that those that are proponents of that argument have no understanding of what the international developments obtain, have, what impact it has on the local economy, and what it is that Guyana ought to do. So that is the second bit I want to talk about in wrapping up. Thirdly, I want to echo the sentiments of what Joel would have mentioned as it relates to the entire CARICOM discussion. And maybe that is something that we ought to come back here and examine in its fullness, is that CARICOM provides for the development component, the economic development component of states in the region. And it is something that we ought not to run away with. Now, if we want to take it down the road of a legal argument, for example, and I won't get into detail on it because obviously I'm not learned in the field of law, but if we want to take it down that road, there are other countries that have applied policy or regulation to protect infant or nascent industries within our regional trading bloc, the CSME. And under the prescription of law, legislation, regulation, as well as policy, all are viewed as being on the same level. All are viewed as being protectionist in nature. And thus, any discussion that we have to have moving forward about a modern CSME and one that is not 1975 or 2001, but one that is 2022 and caters and considers for countries the protection of their particular industries that may be, for example, the natural patrimony of the citizens of that country, ought to necessarily consider some instrument for uh, promotion of domestic industry. We cannot have we cannot have a situation where a country's national patrimony cannot
Mhm.
um, be materially benefited from by the citizens of that
Yeah.
country. And Joel would have made a very good point, and I want to support him 100% on that point and echo the same sentiments as him, that our local content legislation does not uh, does not block anyone from coming to this country. It only sets conditions under which uh, one is able to access, if you will, opportunities within the petroleum sector. So there is no blocking of anyone from coming here. There is no stopping anyone from coming here. But as the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, for example, has been saying for many years, when you are coming, come, find a partner so that we can all benefit. There is benefit in having a local partner. There is benefit in partnering with someone. So essentially, we are not in this country stopping or blocking anyone. We are not telling anyone that they can't come, but we are saying that when you come, partner with Guyanese, and it does not stop anyone from participating in the petroleum sector either. You can participate in the petroleum sector. There are more than 200 areas within which services need to be provided in the petroleum sector. Only 40 have been partially carved out, if you will, for Guyanese. And even where there is a 100% carve out for Guyanese companies, there still is a mechanism through which another company can participate, or a foreigner or a non Guyanese can participate, which is, of course, through partnership.
Yeah,
So
Richard,
there is
we've
no.
really gone way ahead of our time, 15 minutes ahead, and we really apologize. Hey, you got to come back to this show. I know you've got tremendous wealth and knowledge and insight into the sector, as well as
Definitely,
quite a
we
few
need
other
to
sectors.
definitely do a part two.
Yeah, yeah, we definitely could do a part two of this, because this is going to be something that will be discussed, I think, forever for the next, 10, 15, 20 years. So I don't think you're not going to be coming back here. But thanks, Richard, for your time, for your effort in bringing local content to where it is today, for your insight into these matters, and to kind of provide a view for the average Guyanese, as it relates to local content and the oil and gas sector. And of course, we haven't touched you yet on the other sectors in our economy. So you're definitely going to be here again, Joel. Again, thanks. This was a pretty good show, and I think we will continue this. We apologize for going over again. We have a guest who is extremely resourceful, and you need time, of course, to get these things out in the public. With that, I want to say thanks again and good night, and reminding you that we'll be on TVG every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. So in case you miss this live, you can always get it there. So thank you
Slight
again.
correction, Salem. It's 8:30 p.m.
8:30 p.m. Okay, okay, great. All right, well, thanks again and good night, guys.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.
We gonna make it somehow. We will bend like a bow.